It happened in 4 seconds. 4 seconds from the moment the man raised his weapon to the moment he hit the floor. The quiet volunteer nurse nobody paid attention to moved first, precise, controlled, final. When it was over, every assumption about Hannah Marie Cole shattered. Because the woman working overnight shifts at a forgotten border clinic wasn't just a nurse, and the men who walked into that warehouse had chosen the wrong place to test it. 6 hours before the blood, before the needle, before everything, Hannah Cole was sitting on the metal steps of her single-wide trailer watching the sun collapse behind the Patagonia Mountains. The Arizona sky does things at sunset that no painter could capture: bruised purples bleeding into burnt oranges, the kind of colors that make you believe God is showing off. Hannah watched it every night, not because it was beautiful, because it was the only thing in her day that required absolutely nothing from her. The Esperanza Border Health Clinic sat 2 miles north of the Mexican border, in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Nogales that had once been a produce distribution center. You could still smell the ghost of citrus in the walls when the summer heat baked through the metal siding. 4 exam rooms, 1 procedure area with a table older than some of the doctors who'd volunteered there, a pharmacy closet with supplies that were always running low and never quite right, an X-ray machine that worked when it felt like it, which was about 60% of the time. It wasn't a hospital. It wasn't even close. It was a place where people who had nowhere else to go came to be seen by someone who gave a damn. Hannah had been that someone for 18 months. She'd signed up for 6 through Healers Without Walls, a nonprofit that sent medical professionals to underserved border communities and just kept extending. When they asked why, she told them the truth she was comfortable with. Too many patients, not enough hands. The truth she wasn't comfortable with was simpler and harder. She didn't know how to leave people who needed her. She never had. At 34, Hannah Cole looked exactly like what she was: someone who'd been ground down by the world and come out sharper. 5'7", lean but solid, built like the ultra-marathon runner she was. Sandy blonde hair streaked pale from the Arizona sun, always pulled back in a French braid so tight it could survive a Category 5 hurricane. Gray-blue eyes that the clinic director, Dr. Alma Gutierrez, once described as kind but assessing, like she's always deciding whether to hug you or tackle you. It was the freckles that threw people off. A constellation of them scattered across her nose, the only soft thing about her. Patients loved those freckles. Children counted them during exams. Migrant mothers who didn't speak a word of English would point at them and smile. And somehow, that was enough to build trust. Tonight, those hands gentle enough to hold a premature infant, steady enough to thread sutures in a moving vehicle, were wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee while she called her father in Iowa. "How was your day, Dad?" Richard Cole coughed. It was the cough, the one that had started 6 months ago and turned into a diagnosis that began with the word pancreatic and ended with a timeline no father should have to give his daughter. "Oh, you know, watch the corn. It didn't do anything exciting." Hannah smiled. "It hurt. You need to stop standing on the porch in this cold. It's 42 degrees, Hannah. That's practically summer." "Sweetheart." His voice softened, the way it did when he was about to say something real. "Are you happy down there?" She looked at the clinic, at the lights buzzing in exam room 2, where Danny Reyes, the 22-year-old volunteer EMT who'd been there exactly 1 week and still jumped at sudden noises, was restocking supplies. At the hand-painted sign above the door that read Esperanza in faded blue letters. "Hope. I'm getting there, Dad." He knew she was lying. He always had. Even when she was 12 and told him the bruise on her arm was from climbing the oak tree, not from Bobby Patterson at school. Even when she called from Fort Benning and said everything was fine. Really, the training was just hard. Even when she came back from her 4th deployment and said she was okay. She was always okay. You were never good at hiding, Hannah. His voice cracked, and she couldn't tell if it was the cancer or the emotion. "Whatever you're running from, it'll find you, and when it does, you'll remember who you are." She closed her eyes. "I know who I am, Dad. I'm a nurse. You're a lot of things, baby girl. That's just the latest one." After they hung up, she sat with the phone in her lap for a long time. The desert was quiet. The kind of quiet that people from cities mistake for silence, but people from Iowa know is actually filled with sound, wind through mesquite, the scuttle of kangaroo rats, the distant hum of the border fence vibrating in the breeze like a tuning fork struck by a nervous hand. Under her trailer bed, next to a worn Bible and a pair of running shoes with 2,000 miles on them, was a Remington 700 hunting rifle. She told herself it was for coyotes, the four-legged kind. She hadn't told anyone about the notes, 2 of them in the past month, slipped under her trailer door in the hours between midnight and dawn. Same block letters on the same cheap paper. Stop treating cargo. Final warning. She'd burned them both and not called the police because what would she say? What could they do that she couldn't? That was the problem with Hannah Cole. She always thought she could handle it alone. Her satellite phone buzzed at 11:23 p.m., a number she recognized, Maria Elena, a humanitarian aid worker 15 miles south in Nogales. Sonora, Grupo coming your way. 18 people. Family units, some injured. They crossed 2 hours ago. Guide abandoned them in the desert. At least 2 children need immediate care. Standard border night. Hannah was already moving before the call ended, pulling on her scrubs, lacing her boots, shifting from the woman who watched sunsets into the one who saved lives. She didn't know it yet, but this was the last ordinary moment she would ever have. She sent Danny out with flashlights, GPS coordinates, and water bottles. 2 clicks northeast. Look for a dry wash near the power line cut. They'll be following it south. She caught his face pale, uncertain. The look of a kid who'd come here for a line on his med school application and was realizing this wasn't a resume bullet point. Danny. Breathe. Bring them in. I'll prep the rooms. What if they're really hurt? Then you stabilize, transport, and I fix them. That's the deal. Go. He went. She prepped. 4 exam rooms. Saline drips. Gauze. Betadine. Pediatric doses of ibuprofen and acetaminophen, because it was always the kids. The border took everything from the adults, their money, their pride, their shoes sometimes, but it saved its cruelest work for the children. Dehydration, heat stroke, parasites, infections that had gone untreated for weeks because there was no one to treat them and no money to pay if there had been. Esperanza Martinez, the clinic coordinator, 58 years old, born in Mexico, crossed at 19, became a citizen, came back to help, arrived at 11:40. She didn't ask questions. She just started making coffee and laying out blankets in the waiting area. 27 years on the border had taught her that questions could wait. Warmth could not. 40 minutes later, Danny came through the back door. He was supporting a limping woman, his face tight with the controlled panic of someone who was very much not okay but doing his best to pretend otherwise. Behind him, families. Children carried on shoulders. An elderly man being helped by 2 teenage boys. A pregnant woman clutching her belly with both hands and walking with the careful deliberation of someone who knew each step could be the one that started something she wasn't ready for. 18 people. Hannah counted them as they came through. She always counted. It was a habit from another life, one she didn't talk about. One that lived in the spaces between her heartbeats like an embedded shard of shrapnel that had never been fully extracted. She counted 18. Then the door opened again, and the night changed forever. 6 men who were not migrants walked through the entrance of the Esperanza Border Health Clinic. They moved differently, controlled, deliberate, spaced apart in a pattern that Hannah's body recognized before her mind did. Tactical formation. She felt the skin on the back of her neck tighten. A primal alarm system that hadn't fired in 8 years suddenly screaming. They were wearing black tactical pants, body armor, night vision gear pushed up on their foreheads like crowns. They carried weapons, rifles, sidearms, the kind of hardware that costs money and speaks fluently in the language of violence. These weren't bandits. These weren't coyotes. These were cartel sicarios, professional killers, and there were 6 of them. The lead man surveyed the clinic with the calm assessment of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. He was maybe 38, broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome once before the violence carved it into something harder. A small gold crucifix hung at his throat. He crossed himself when he entered. That detail, the crossing, sent a chill down Hannah's spine that had nothing to do with the desert night. He spoke in English. No accent. Everyone inside. Now, one of the migrant women, young, maybe 23, clutching a toddler whose face was buried in her neck, started crying. Please. They made us walk with them. They said if we didn't. The man silenced her with a look. Not a word, not a gesture, just a look that contained the full, compressed history of every terrible thing he'd ever done, and every terrible thing he was willing to do next. The woman went silent. The toddler didn't. He turned to Hannah. You're the nurse. Hannah's hands were still holding gauze for a 7-year-old boy named Tomas who'd come in an hour ago with an ear infection. Her hands were steady. That was the first thing that would have alarmed anyone who knew what to look for. In a room full of guns and crying children and the sharp copper smell of fear, her hands were absolutely steady. I'm the nurse practitioner. This is a humanitarian clinic. We don't have. You have what we need. He gestured to one of his men, who pulled a woman from the back of the group. She was pale, sweating, clutching her abdomen. The blood soaking through her clothes was dark, oxidized, hours old. Hannah's trained eye read it instantly. Penetrating abdominal trauma, liver involvement. The woman was dying, and she'd been dying for a while. Fix her, the man said. His hand rested on his pistol. His eyes went to the children huddled in the corner. Or we start with them. The room went silent. Even the toddler stopped crying, as if some ancient infant instinct recognized the proximity of a predator. Hannah looked at the dying woman. She looked at the children. She looked at the 6 armed men standing in her clinic. The place she'd come to disappear. The place she'd chosen specifically because nobody would ever find her here. Nobody ever had. Until now. The man's name was Alejandro Merida. His people called him El Santo, the Saint, because he crossed himself before every kill. He'd been doing it for 12 years, ever since a corrupt career in the Mexican Federal Police had transitioned seamlessly into a more honest one in the Sinaloa cartel. At least the cartel didn't pretend to serve the people. Hannah didn't know his name yet. She didn't need to. She knew what he was. She'd seen the type before in Coringal, in Nangarhar, in places that didn't exist on any map she was allowed to discuss. True believers. Men who killed not for money or power, but for faith in something larger than themselves. Those were always the most dangerous ones. Mercenaries could be bought. Fanatics had to be stopped. She pushed that thought down. Buried it with the others. She was a nurse now. That was the deal she'd made with herself 8 years ago when she'd walked out of the 75th Ranger Regiment and into a life that didn't require her to know the difference between a carotid artery and a target. I need to examine her, Hannah said, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had given orders in operating rooms that didn't have walls. If she's got a liver laceration, I need space, light, and time. Not guns in my face. Santo studied her. There was something in his gaze and intelligence behind the violence, the kind that noticed things. You have all 3. For now, they moved the dying woman, Lourdes Valdez, though Hannah wouldn't learn her name for another hour, onto the procedure table. The wound was bad. Gunshot. Entry on the right flank. The bullet still somewhere inside. The liver bleeding slowly into her abdominal cavity like a faucet someone had forgotten to close. She'd been walking on this for 8 hours. She should have been dead already. The fact that she wasn't told Hannah 2 things. This woman was extraordinarily tough, and someone had applied field pressure correctly at some point before abandoning her to the desert. While Hannah worked gloves on, betadine swabbed, IV running, her eyes moved. Not to the wound, to the room. She counted. She'd always counted. It was the first thing they'd taught her at RASP, the Ranger Assessment and Selection Program, before they taught her to shoot, before they taught her to suture, before they taught her anything else. Count first. Know what you have. Know what you're facing. Then decide. 6 hostiles. Weapons. 4 rifles. 2 sidearms. Body armor on all 6. Night vision. Comms. 2 of them had radios. Positioning. Lead man. At the procedure room door. 1 at the main entrance. 1 at the back exit. 2 roving, watching the migrants. 1 standing over her, watching her hands. That last one worried her. He was different from the others. Lean. Quiet. He moved with a precision that civilians didn't develop. He watched her the way a predator watches another predator with recognition. His name, she would learn later, was Victor Fuentes, former GAF Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, Mexican Special Forces. He'd been trained by Americans. He'd trained with Rangers. He knew what he was looking at. He just hadn't admitted it to himself yet. Something's wrong with her, Victor murmured to Santo. She's a nurse. She's trained for emergencies. No, this is different. Watch her eyes. She's not scared. She's assessing. Hannah heard them. She pretended she didn't. She bent over Lourdes, adjusted the IV, checked the pulse, weak but present. She spoke to the woman in Spanish, the medical Spanish she'd learned not in a classroom but in field hospitals and forward operating bases across 3 continents. Can you hear me? I'm going to help you. I need you to stay with me. Lourdes' eyes opened, brown, glassy with pain, but sharp underneath. She grabbed Hannah's wrist, hard. Harder than a woman with a bullet in her liver should have been able to. She whispered in English. They won't let anyone live. You understand? They can't. Hannah nodded. I understand. And she did. Whatever these men wanted from this woman, information, confession, evidence, they intended to take it and leave no witnesses. The 18 migrants huddled in the waiting room weren't hostages. They were loose ends. Danny, Esperanza, Hannah herself. They were all dead the moment these men got what they came for. She looked through the procedure room doorway at the waiting area. Children, 12 of them, ranging from a toddler to a teenager. She counted them the way she'd counted children in Syria, the ones she'd saved, and the ones she'd been ordered to leave behind. Those numbers lived in her head like a ledger that never balanced. Tonight, she decided, the ledger would balance. I need the children moved to exam room 3. She said to Santo. Her voice was clinical, detached, the voice of a medical professional managing a workspace. Contamination risk. If she's septic and I open her up, this room becomes a biohazard. Children can't be near it, Santo considered. Rodrigo, move the children. The young enforcer, nervous, early 20s, eyes too wide, herded the children and their mothers into exam room 3, away from the procedure room, away from the back door, into the most defensible room in the building, with the thickest walls and only one entrance. Hannah hadn't mentioned any of those things, but she knew them. She also told Danny to move medical supplies to the supply closet adjacent to the back hallway. I'll need more saline, more gauze, the whole crash cart. She was positioning obstacles, creating choke points, clearing sight lines. The clinic was becoming something it had never been before. It was becoming a battle space, and the woman shaping it had been doing exactly this in worse conditions, in darker places, for longer than any of these men had been killing. 800 meters northeast of the Esperanza Clinic, lying prone behind a ridge of desert scrub that smelled like creosote and dried blood, his own DEA Special Agent Rafael Mendoza was trying very hard not to pass out. He'd been shot twice. Once in the left thigh, once through the meat of his right shoulder. The thigh was the problem, not arterial, or he'd already be dead, but deep enough that every movement sent a fresh wave of white-hot pain radiating from his hip to his jaw. He'd applied a tourniquet using his belt and a stick. Field medicine. Ugly but functional. The kind of medicine Hannah Cole had taught him. Rafa had been part of the DEA extraction team that was supposed to bring Lourdes Valdez across the border 6 hours ago. 4 agents, 1 armored vehicle, 1 informant with $200 million worth of cartel secrets memorized in her head. Clean operation. In and out. Except the cartel had been waiting at the crossing point with more men and more guns than anyone had anticipated. 3 agents dead. Rafa wounded, crawling into the desert while the sicarios took Lourdes and marched her north with a group of migrants they'd intercepted as cover. He'd been tracking them for 6 hours. limping, bleeding, following their GPS signals on the encrypted DEA tablet that had somehow survived the ambush. When they stopped at the clinic, he'd positioned himself on the ridge and pulled out his rifle scope. That's when he saw her. Through the scope, through the dirty window of the procedure room, he saw a blonde woman with a French braid leaning over a patient on a table. She was wearing blue scrubs and an expression he recognized from a place he never talked about at dinner parties. An expression of absolute, controlled fury, masked as professional calm. He adjusted the scope, zoomed in, watched her hands. "No way," he whispered. He'd served with Hannah Cole for 3 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment. He'd watched those hands pack his collapsed lung with gauze in Nangarhar province, while bullets sparked off the rocks around them. He'd felt those hands steady, impossibly steady, insert a chest tube between his ribs while she directed suppressive fire with her other hand. He still had the scar, 5 inches long, just below his right pectoral. She'd told him it would fade. It hadn't. He was glad. The last time he'd seen her was at Fort Benning, the day she processed out. She'd looked like someone who'd already left, long before the paperwork was signed. He'd asked her what she was going to do. She'd said, "Something quiet." He'd said, "You're the loudest, quiet person I've ever met." She hadn't laughed. 8 years. No contact. He'd searched for her, casually at first. Then with increasing concern as the years passed and none of their mutual army contacts had heard from her. It was like she'd walked off the face of the earth. She'd walked to the edge of it instead. He keyed his radio. His backup, a DEA tactical team, scrambled from the Tucson field office, was 40 minutes out. "This is Mendoza. I need you to listen to me very carefully. The Esperanza Clinic in Nogales. 6 hostiles inside. 18 civilian hostages. 1 HVT Lourdes Valdez. Alive. Gunshot wound. And there's a nurse in there. Copy, Mendoza. We'll handle the nurse. What's your condition?" "The nurse isn't a nurse." He swallowed. Tasted blood and dust. "Pull military records for Hannah Marie Cole. Staff Sergeant. 75th Ranger Regiment. 2nd Battalion. Call sign. Shepherd." Silence on the radio. Then, "Say again? You're telling me there's a ranger in that clinic?" "I'm telling you there's a ranger in that clinic, and she doesn't know I'm out here. And those 6 men inside have no idea who they're locked in with." He watched through the scope as Hannah moved through the procedure room, her body cutting angles he recognized, her feet finding positions that weren't accidental. She was mapping the room. She was preparing. "Expedite your ETA," he said. "And when you get here, be very careful about who you point your weapons at. Shepherd doesn't miss." He set the radio down and pressed his forehead into the dirt. The pain was getting worse. The desert cold was seeping through his body armor into the wound, and his fingers were going numb, which meant either the temperature was dropping or he was losing more blood than he thought. Probably both. He thought about the last time he'd been this hurt. Nangarhar Province, 2016. A valley that looked like the surface of Mars. An ambush from 3 sides at once, and the sound of bullets hitting rock that you never forget no matter how many years or therapy sessions pass. 2 rangers dead before anyone could react. Rafa on the ground with a collapsed lung and a femur that looked like someone had taken a bat to it. The world going gray at the edges, the way it does when your body starts making decisions your brain hasn't authorized. And then Hannah, sliding in next to him like she'd been born in that dirt, hands already moving. "Hey, Rafa. Bad day. I'm going to fix it. Stay with me." Matter of fact, like she was ordering lunch. Like there weren't tracers streaking overhead and a man screaming 20 feet away. She'd packed his lung. She'd splinted his femur. She'd given him her own blood literally. Connected her arm to his with tubing and a needle because the supply was gone, and his type matched hers. She'd kept him alive for 6 hours. She'd kept 3 of them alive for 11. They'd given her a silver star. She'd given it back. He'd never understood that. He understood it now, watching her through a scope in a clinic 2 miles from the border, preparing to do what she'd always done, stand between death and the people it wanted. There was nothing he could do from out here. But he'd seen Hannah Cole work under impossible conditions before, and he knew something that every ranger who'd ever served with her knew. If Shepard was in that room, those people were going to live. He'd never been more certain of anything. Inside the clinic, time was a living thing, and it was running out. Lourdes was crashing. The liver hemorrhage was accelerating. Hannah needed blood. The clinic kept a small emergency supply, O negative, in a refrigerator in the supply closet, and she needed it now. But the blood was across the room from the procedure table, and between her and it stood Alejandro El Santo Merida, who had moved closer to observe the surgery with the morbid curiosity of a man who'd caused more wounds than he'd witnessed repaired. "She's dying," Hannah said. Flat, factual. "Then work faster. I need blood. It's in the supply closet. If I don't get it in the next 3 minutes, she bleeds out, and whatever you want from her dies with her." Santo flicked his gaze to the closet. Back to Hannah. He stepped aside just slightly, just enough for her to pass. It was a gap, a small one, the kind of gap that a civilian would use to walk through, the kind of gap that a ranger would use for something else entirely. But not yet. Not yet. "Danny," she called. Her voice was steady. The steadiness wasn't an act, it was a state, a mode she'd entered without deciding to, the way a pilot's hands find the controls in turbulence. "Bring me 2 units of Oneg from the fridge. And the ketamine. Second shelf, blue label." Danny brought them. His hands were shaking so badly the bags swung like pendulums. She took them from him without comment. "When I tell you, I need you to apply direct pressure to her liver. Both hands. Don't stop until I say." I don't know if I can." She looked at him, held his eyes, the same look she'd given terrified young privates in the Korangal. "You can. You will. Because she needs you to. And that's enough. Okay?" Danny swallowed, nodded. "Okay." She turned back to Lourdes, hung the blood, started the transfusion. Then, while adjusting the IV line, she palmed the ketamine vial, smooth, invisible. A magician's move, perfected not on stages but in combat aid stations where supplies had to be hidden from hostile eyes. She loaded a syringe under the pretense of checking the IV port, capped it, slid it into her scrub pocket. No one saw. Except Victor. Victor saw. He didn't see the ketamine, but he saw the movement, the precise economy of her hands, the way she accomplished 2 tasks in a single motion. He'd been trained to move like that. He'd been trained by people who moved like that. And a cold realization was forming in his mind like ice on a windshield. This woman was not what she appeared to be. "Santo," he said quietly, "we need to talk. After. Now." Victor pulled him to the hallway. Hannah heard them through the thin wall, murmuring in Spanish. She caught fragments. Military. The way she moves. Something wrong. She had minutes, maybe less. She looked at the procedure room, at the positions she'd mapped in her mind. Santo would come back through the door, Victor behind him, the silent one, El Fantasma. The scarred man who watched everything and said nothing was standing by the supply closet, 3 feet to her left. Miguel, the youngest, the one with the conscience and the nervous eyes, was near the doorway to the waiting room. The 2 cousins, Rodrigo and Beto, were with the migrants. 6 targets, 1 nurse, 18 families, and somewhere in the desert, someone else. She didn't know who. She didn't know he was there. But she'd spent 18 months on this border, and she knew the sound of the desert at night the way a farmer knows the sound of the weather. Something was different out there. Something was watching. It didn't matter. She couldn't count on something she couldn't see. Her father's voice, from 6 hours ago. "Whatever you're running from, it'll find you. And when it does, you'll remember who you are." She remembered. Staff Sergeant Hannah Marie Cole, 75th Ranger Regiment. Call sign Shepard, 8 years, 7 deployments. Silver Star, returned. 3 men alive because she refused to let them die in a valley half the world away. 40 civilians saved because she disobeyed an order. 23 women and children freed from shipping containers because she went through the door first. She'd sworn she'd never be that person again. But standing in this clinic, with 12 children behind a wall and 6 killers between them and tomorrow, she understood something her father had always known and she'd been too stubborn to admit. You don't stop being who you are. You just stop pretending you're someone else. Lourdes' monitor beeped. Her blood pressure was dropping. It was now or never. Hannah called out, "I'm losing her. I need everyone out of this room. Contamination risk. Now." Santo came back through the door, Victor behind him. They both stopped at the threshold. Santo opened his mouth to speak. Hannah stumbled. It was perfect. A tired nurse, 18 hours into her shift, catching her foot on a table leg as she rushed to her dying patient. She fell toward Santo, not at him, just near him, close enough for her hand to find his neck. The 1-4 gauge needle entered his carotid artery with surgical precision. Not the precision of someone who had learned anatomy in a classroom. The precision of someone who had used anatomy to save lives in combat and knew, with terrible intimacy, exactly where life ended. He dropped. 4 seconds. That's how long it took El Santo to die. That's how long Hannah had before the world caught up. She used every one of them. The surgical tray was in her right hand before Santo's body hit the floor. She spun and threw it not at Victor, who was reaching for his rifle, but at Miguel, the youngest, the one standing near the doorway where the children were. The tray caught him across the face, a 2-pound stainless steel disc traveling at the speed of 8 years of compressed violence. His weapon went off target. The shot punched into the ceiling. Plaster rained down like dirty snow. El Fantasma moved. He was fast, faster than a man his age should have been. The kind of fast that came from Zeta training and a lifetime of being the one nobody saw coming. His hand found his sidearm, drew it, turned toward Hannah, and stopped, because Hannah had already reached him. The ketamine syringe loaded, prepped, hidden in her pocket, since she'd palmed it during the IV setup, went into the muscle of his neck. Not a kill dose, a paralytic dose. He'd be conscious but unable to move for 20 minutes. His eyes went wide, then glassy. His gun arm dropped to his side like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He stood there, swaying, a statue of a man who'd once terrified drug lords across 3 Mexican states, defeated by a nurse with a needle and a plan. Outside, through the window, 800 meters away, Rafa Mendoza watched through his rifle scope and felt something he hadn't felt since the Corangal Valley. Absolute certainty. The blonde nurse had just taken down 2 cartel enforcers in 6 seconds using a needle and a surgical tray. She hadn't used a gun. She hadn't needed one. "This is Mendoza," he keyed. "Expedite. I repeat, expedite. Shepard is active." Inside, chaos erupted. Rodrigo and Beto, the young cousins from Culiacan, the ones who'd never killed before and were not equipped for whatever this was, panicked. Rodrigo broke for the back exit. He made it 4 steps before Esperanza Martinez, 58 years old, grandmother, former migrant, woman who'd lost a son to cartel violence, and carried that fury in a place where most people carried their souls, swung a mop handle into his shins with the force of 2 decades of grief. He went down, Danny Reyes, hands still shaking, grabbed IV tubing from the nearest rack and zip-tied Rodrigo's wrists behind his back. It wasn't pretty. It held. Beto froze. He looked at Santo's body on the floor. He looked at El Fantasma, standing motionless, eyes open and seeing nothing. He looked at the blonde woman who'd done this, who was already turning toward him, a scalpel in her right hand and an expression on her face that he would remember for the rest of his life. Not rage, not cruelty, clarity. The look of someone who knew exactly what she was willing to do and had already done the math. He dropped his weapon, put his hands up, started crying. He was 27 years old and he wanted his mother. That left Victor. Victor Fuentes was not Rodrigo. He was not Beto. He was a former Special Forces soldier with combat training that paralleled Hannah's own, and he did not panic. He took cover behind the doorframe of the procedure room. He created distance. He brought his rifle up and sighted down the hallway. And for the first time since the siege began, Hannah Cole felt something she hadn't felt in 8 years. She felt matched. They faced each other across the procedure room, 6 feet of scuffed linoleum and a lifetime of violence between them. He had a rifle. She had a scalpel and the terrain she'd been shaping for the past 40 minutes. "You were military," Victor said. It wasn't a question. American military. Hannah positioned herself between Victor and the doorway to exam room 3, where 12 children were pressed against the far wall. Her body was a shield. It had always been a shield. That was the part of military service she'd never been able to leave behind, not the violence, but the willingness to stand between harm and the harmless. "I'm a nurse practitioner," she said. "This is a humanitarian clinic. No nurse moves like that." "Who were you?" Hannah. Quiet. "Someone who learned that saving lives and taking them require the same skills. I chose saving. You chose wrong." Victor's finger was on the trigger, but he was hesitating. He knew what he was seeing. He'd been trained by people who moved like this woman. He'd seen the economy of motion, the way she sliced angles, the way she cleared her own position before engaging. This wasn't self-defense. This was doctrine. "You can't win this," he said. "Even if you kill me, there are more outside. More coming. There's no one outside. Your backup is 40 miles away." She took a breath. "And the man in the desert with the rifle? He's not yours." Victor's eyes flicked to the window. A fraction of a second. The oldest mistake in combat. Looking where your enemy points, instead of at your enemy. She was already moving. The scalpel opened his forearm, a precise cut, radial artery. Not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to make his hand useless. He dropped the rifle. Her knee took his legs out. Her elbow finished it. Ranger combatives. Brutal. Efficient. Over in 6 seconds. She picked up his rifle. Walked to the window. Tapped on the glass. 3 times. Pause. 2 times. In the desert, Rafa Mendoza saw the signal through his scope. 3-2. Ranger recognition code. A code they'd used in Nangarhar, in Syria, in places that didn't have names on any map. He allowed himself one moment of disbelief, one moment to marvel at the fact that Staff Sergeant Hannah Cole, the woman who'd returned a Silver Star because she didn't think she deserved it, who'd walked away from the greatest fighting force on Earth to hold the hands of dying migrants in a clinic nobody had heard of, had just neutralized 6 cartel sicarios with a needle, a scalpel, a syringe of ketamine, and the kind of quiet, devastating competence that the 75th Ranger Regiment had spent 100 years perfecting. Then he keyed his radio. "Shepard is secure. All hostiles down. Expedite medical, we have wounded." The DEA tactical team arrived 14 minutes later, which meant they'd driven the 65 miles from Tucson in a time that would have impressed a NASCAR driver and terrified everyone else on the road. They came through the clinic doors in full tactical gear, weapons up, voices sharp, and stopped. They found 6 cartel sicarios neutralized, 1 dead, 5 incapacitated, 18 migrants unharmed, every single one, 1 EMT in shock but functional, 1 clinic coordinator holding a mop handle and daring anyone to come near the children, and 1 nurse practitioner in blood-soaked scrubs, elbow deep in the abdomen of a cartel defector, performing surgery with instruments that belonged in a warehouse and skills that belonged somewhere else entirely. "Clear the room," Hannah said without looking up. "And somebody get me real sutures. These are veterinary grade." Lourdes Valdez survived. She would spend 3 weeks in a Tucson hospital, followed by 6 months in witness protection, followed by a testimony that would dismantle the Sinaloa cartel's Pacific Corridor and put 23 people in federal prison. The account numbers she'd memorized, $200 million in routing information, would lead to the largest cartel asset seizure in DEA history. But that was later. That was headlines and courtrooms and a world that Hannah Cole would never enter. Now, in the gray light before dawn, with the DEA processing statements and paramedics treating the migrants and 2 ambulances parked where her trailer sat, Rafa Mendoza limped through the clinic door and found her. She was sitting on the floor of exam room 2, scrubbing blood off her hands with antiseptic wipes. Methodical. Thorough. The way she'd scrubbed after every operation in the field, not because the blood was hard to remove, but because the scrubbing was the transition, the bridge between the person who did the violence and the person who lived the rest of the day. He sat next to her. He was limping badly. He'd been shot twice. He was smiling. Staff Sergeant Cole. She didn't look up. I'm not a staff sergeant anymore. You never stopped being one. He leaned his head back against the wall. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and outside, the first hint of dawn was painting the Patagonia mountains in colors that nobody would be watching tonight. I looked for you. After you got out, nobody knew where you went. That was the point. You could have done anything. Hospitals, VA, private practice. But you came here. A clinic in the middle of nowhere, treating people nobody else will touch. He paused. Same thing you did in Syria. In Honduras. You always found the ones who needed you most. Hannah stopped scrubbing, held still. In the waiting room, she could hear the sounds of rescue children's voices, radio chatter, the particular quality of noise that accompanies the aftermath of survival. A grandmother being treated for dehydration, 2 teenage boys giving statements in halting English, Tomas, the 7-year-old with the ear infection, fast asleep on a cot, his mother's hand on his chest, monitoring his breathing the way mothers do when they've come close to losing everything and need proof that they haven't. The army pointed me at targets, Hannah said finally. I got to decide what to do when I got there. Out here, she gestured at the clinic, at the walls she'd turned into a fortress, at the exam rooms she'd converted to safe zones, at the procedure table where she'd saved a woman the cartel wanted dead. I get to choose who I help. And tonight they chose for me. She looked at the migrants being led to warm vehicles, wrapped in blankets, offered water and food by people who spoke their language and knew their names, children reunited with parents, families intact, all of them, every single one. I chose right. Rafa nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something, a challenge coin. 75th Ranger Regiment. 2nd Battalion. The same coin they'd both carried. In another life. In another world. He held it out to her. She looked at it for a long time. I don't need it, she said. I know. Take it anyway. She did. She held it in her palm. And for a moment she was 23 again. Standing in a valley in Afghanistan with blood on her hands and 3 dying men who were going to live because she refused to let them die. She'd been so angry that day. Angry at the mission, at the enemy, at the mountains themselves for being so high, and the helicopters for being so slow. She'd turned that anger into action, into survival, into 11 hours of medicine performed under fire that they'd called heroic and she'd called delayed death. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't sure when that had changed. Maybe tonight. Maybe earlier. Maybe the moment she'd signed on at Esperanza and started treating people who weren't targets, who weren't objectives, who were just human beings walking through a door because they had nowhere else to go. Rafa made sure her military background didn't leak. He owed her a scar, a life, and 8 years of silence. The news reported it as Border Clinic Nurse Saves Migrants from Cartel Attack. No rank, no unit, no call sign. The clinic reopened 2 weeks later. New funding arrived. National attention does that. Interview requests, job offers, documentary pitches. Hannah turned them all down. I'm not a story, she told Dr. Gutierrez. I'm just a nurse. She returned to work the next night. Same shift, same trailer, same patients who needed someone to care about them when the rest of the world looked away. But the migrants talked. They always do. In shelters from Nogales to Tucson, in church basements and community centers and the back rooms of restaurants where people gather to share the stories that keep them alive. They whispered about a woman at a border clinic, La Pastora, the shepherd, the blonde nurse who stood between the wolves and the flock and didn't flinch. They said she worked overnight shifts. They said she never turned anyone away. They said that if you were hurt, if you were lost, if you had walked through the desert with nothing and arrived with even less, there was a place called Esperanza Hope, where a woman with freckles on her nose and steel in her spine would take care of you. They said she was just a nurse. They were wrong. And they were exactly right. Hannah would have hated the nickname if she knew about it. She kept working anyway. She called her father that night. He answered on the first ring. the way dying men do when every call might be the last. "How was your day, sweetheart?" She smiled. "It didn't hurt this time. I remembered who I am, Dad." Silence on the line. Then, softly, "Took you long enough." She laughed. It sounded like the first honest sound she'd made in 8 years. "There's a clinic on the outskirts of Nogales, Arizona, where the lights are always on. It doesn't look like much, a converted warehouse with peeling paint and an X-ray machine that works when it feels like it. You won't find it on any list of great hospitals. You won't find its nurse practitioner on any list of decorated heroes, though she should be on both. What Hannah Cole discovered that night, what the blood and the fear and the sound of a needle finding its target taught her, was something we all know, but most of us spend our lives trying to forget. You cannot outrun who you are. The skills we bury, the instincts we suppress, the parts of ourselves we're afraid of, they don't disappear. They wait. And when the moment comes, when the wolves are at the door and the flock is behind you, those buried things become the only things that matter. Some people choose healing because they're gentle. Others choose it because they know exactly how much damage the world can do, and they've decided to stand in the way. Hannah Cole stood in the way, and 18 families got to see tomorrow because of it. You just spent almost an hour with Hannah Cole. You saw what her choice cost and what it saved. If this story stayed with you, take 1 second and share it with someone who serves quietly and never asks for recognition. Drop a comment and tell me which moment hit you hardest. I read every single one. If you're new here, welcome. We tell stories about ordinary people carrying extraordinary weight. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Because the person everyone underestimated, they're not done yet. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next story.